The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by Case IQ, a global provider of whistleblowing case management and compliance solutions. Learn more at caseiq.com. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turtletell from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics in Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us today from the San Francisco Bay Area is Mark Diamond. Mark is president and CEO of Contouro. And today we're going to be talking about the issue of records retention. Mark, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. Generally, record retention is thought of as more of a legal issue than a compliance one, but you think it can be a driver of compliance, not just sort of a compliance chore. How so?
Well, you're right, Adam, and we've seen a fairly significant change really over the last 5 years. The records retention schedule has traditionally been under legal, and to be honest, it's been a bit of a check the box activity. We got one, oh yeah, okay, that's good, next. But actually, our lowly records retention policy and schedule is now a big deal because it not only drives the legal requirements of what we have, it's actually increasingly important in the world of privacy and managing personal information. Huge impact on e-discovery risks and cost. It has an impact on, people don't think about this, but in a world of electronic information, employee productivity and collaboration, it can be a huge factor in employee productivity and collaboration. And then likewise, we are now seeing it sort of poke its head into the world of using generative AI in a compliant and defensible way. And again, it's really it's important. It's a driver, all of which obviously impact compliance and risk.
Well, and there's another, I think, good point you raise it, that there's so much data being generated and documents being generated, whether it's through standard email, reports, texts, everything else, and the whole world of generative AI. It's important to have a sense of what you have and how long you hold it. Now, there are other benefits, though, you see in record retention. What are they?
Well, and I'll sort of go through the list. So let's go through the basics. I call it the union card. We have legal and regulatory requirements. This isn't terribly new, that require us to retain some information for a period of time, or sometimes, based on an event, when an employee leaves, we have to keep it for a period of time. But a lot of organizations also have large amounts of information which have business value. Now, the business value could be everything from intellectual property to trade secrets to processes to procedure. We all use electronic information. And one of the changes we're seeing is organizations are defining records based on, hey, does this have business value? Sometimes exclusive of legal and regulatory requirements. It's okay to define a record in your records retention schedule just because it's valuable. And part of the statement we're making by defining a record based on the areas of business value is, well, we'll identify this, we'll make this stuff available, and we'll make it accessible. We don't want to treat this as something different. And so increasingly, as organizations both define in the schedule, and more important as they execute it, let's include in there what the business value is. And so that's a big part of it, especially because, and I think we all know this, we may think of records as being paper, but 98% of the information that most organizations send to receive comes to us in electronic. Matter of fact, most of the paper is copies of information that was sourced to us electronically.
And along those lines of ways to use this, you see great benefits from a productivity and collaboration standpoint, correct?
Well, it's funny because historically we've divorced the legal and regulatory requirements from the business value. And so what most organizations have done is, employees sort of in the world of electronic, they want to save everything forever. That's not good, because not only does that create risk, some of that's going to be personal information. Obviously, if we save everything forever, we're going to drive up e-discovery cost. We're going to be less defensible. But the area that a lot of organizations are beginning to realize is if I save everything forever, well, I'm going to have so much clutter as an employee. employees say, oh, I need this stuff. But if you have too much stuff, you won't be able to find anything. And likewise, if you ever have any turnover, if you, expand a group, your peers are not going to be able to see everything that they have and be able to access information. So the information gets lost in the clutter. And so again, it's sort of counterintuitive. If we can narrow the set of information we want to save and make it accessible, really understand what information we don't want to keep, we're actually going to be more productive because we're going to be saving the right high value, higher business value information and getting rid of all what in the industry we call rot, redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. And again, the key to going back to this, the one policy, we believe at best practices, let's capture what we want to save and for how long and what we want to get rid of in the records retention policy and schedule. That should define it as I said, legal and regulatory limits and business value. And then privacy comes into play in this too.
Well, and I got to say, I'm guilty of that, and I've also seen it in my career, the sort of pain of excess, when you take over somebody else's role and they hand you box after box of files and not knowing what of that is worth looking at. And for your own self, you can get lost trying to find things. So how should document retention schedules be formed?
We're a big believer in a modern compliance schedule. And we're seeing many organizations transition from the more traditional approach. Traditional is, hey, it's paper-based, it's super detailed. There's not a lot of buy-in from the business. And so what we're seeing, that older, less useful, potentially less compliant, is to, hey, let's have a simpler records retention schedule, sometimes fewer categories of records. I alluded to, let's have legal and regulatory amounts, let's have business value. Let's define in there which of our records have personal information. And then let's document what the legitimate business need is for retaining that personal information. And what we're trying to do here is sync up the legal and regulatory retention requirements, because traditionally records retention is what's the minimum period you need to keep stuff. And let's synchronize that in a single policy with, okay, what personal information, what's sort of the maximum we can keep personal information, or if we're going to keep it for longer, how do we define what the legitimate business need is? One of the trends we're seeing is not having a separate data retention policy for privacy, for example, but having one sort of super schedule that has all these elements that collapses the data retention policy and the records retention schedule into one that tends to be more comprehensive. And probably the biggest area is, let's drive a consensus with the business. Let's socialize it. Have we caught all the high value business information? Have we caught all the record types? Have we caught not just the typical record types, but company specific records? That's a big driver. We see a lot of companies that have these off-the-shelf policies that are really good at capturing typical records, but they miss a very large chunk of very important company specific records. And so by the time the records retention policy schedule, on one hand, you're right, it is a legal document. On the other hand, we probably want to think about it as a consensus building document and sort of getting everybody on the same page. And the idea being is, if we can build a more modern schedule that has a consensus with everybody, when it comes time to execute, execution will be much easier. It'll be something we can automate to a much greater extent. We're going to be in much higher compliance with it. Again, versus having the traditional schedule that sits on the shelf, which quite frankly just creates more risk. That's not only not helpful, you can argue it's hurtful to be able to do that. And so we really see those as many of the key attributes of having a good policy and schedule.
And I want to go back to something you said that I think was a really good point there, which is trying to get all of your schedules aligned. Obviously, it builds greater consistency for the organization, but it's a lot easier on employees if they don't have to spend time saying, is this a privacy issue and I got to go to this policy? Is it a something else issue and I got to go to that policy? Having it all work together makes things a lot better on a lot of levels. And then at the end, you touched on the topic of automation, and you see a role record retention plays in that. Can we talk about that a little bit more? I mean, everybody is focused these days on automation, using AI, for example, to help automate processes. Where does record retention fit with all of this?
Great question. So let me talk about how we're doing it today, and let me talk about how we're going to be doing it in the not too distant future. So first and foremost, I think you generally have to automate your records retention policy and schedule. And we've talked about this in the past. There's something called the 5-second rule. The entire time, if you have an employee that needs to has a document, has a file or an email, and they got to figure out, do I save this or not? The maximum amount of time you have for your entire process for looking it up and researching and putting it someplace and tagging can't be longer than 5 seconds. If it's longer than 5 seconds, most of your employees, even the well-meaning ones, will blow off your process. And so we want to follow the 5-second rule. So the only way we're going to be able to follow the 5-second rule is if we automate it. And here's the crazy thing. There are different ways to automate. There's sort of machine learning that you can use and trainable classifiers, and those work well for certain types of information, like information security or sensitive data or certain types of personal information. They don't really work well with records. What we're finding is that organizations are instead teaching their systems all the rules. I'm going to set up a place for this department, and here's the for these groups of employees. May not be the entire all the repositories in the department, but we're gonna put up these formatted folders, and this is where we're gonna put our records. And it's sort of a drag and drop. Instead of putting it on my OneDrive or on my file share, I'm gonna put it in these managed repositories out here. And when I put it there, we're going to teach the system all of the rules. The system will automatically tag it for sensitivity, for retention. If it's on legal hold, we're going to teach all the rules on the system. So the best practice today for automation is what we call a data placement and automation, where we put it something we've taught the system. And here's the good news, or the crazy thing. You can do this with base E3 version of Microsoft 365. You don't need to buy fancy new technologies. You have that capability. Now it needs to be configured. We have to set it up, and again, we need the right policy. You could do that, and we work with many global complex enterprises, many small ones, where we just use your E3 version of Microsoft 365. Don't need to buy add-on products. Now that's not to say all the world of unstructured data can or should go into M365, but you can go an awful long way with technology that you already own today. So today it's sort of what we call that we gotta set up the right areas, and we're gonna drag it to there. And these could be team site, these could be SharePoint sites. In some limited cases, we could have as a OneDrive site, but we sort of set it up ahead of time, and then we teach the system, and the system applies all the rules. That's how companies are doing it today as a best practice. We're changing in the very not too distant future. We do believe, unlike machine learning or trainable classifiers, you buy these fancy tools which kind of work but not really. We do believe when as generative AI comes out in the next year or two, generative AI will be much smarter and will be, quite frankly, better than humans at doing this records classification. And again, we're classifying not only for records, for data security classification, for legal hold, for access controls, all these rules that give us a headache. Going to be able to automate that, and pretty soon we're really going to be able to sit back and let generative AI understand what's a record and not. Now there's issues there. There's correctness. There's compliance issues. I don't want to say that's trivial, but the technology is very much going that way. And what has traditionally been a difficult problem is going to get even easier moving forward.
Well, maybe the first time I've ever heard somebody say something in compliance is going to get easier, so I appreciate that a lot. Mark, thanks for sharing these insights with us today. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turteltaub from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.